Hi, this is Paul. Where do you look for help when you get afraid, when things are tough, when you get anxious? A lot of people look to money. What was it that Aaron made when Moses went up the mountain, stayed up there longer than expected? Aaron got nervous. He made a golden calf. Why a calf? Now, I've got a picture up on the screen, and might not be immediately obvious to figure out what it's of, but in a moment you will. It's the big bronze bull on Wall Street. What's with us? Why is a statue of a bronze bull on Wall Street? Why did Aaron build a golden calf? A number of years ago, you can find the sermon or some of the sermon on my blog. You might even be able to find it in my old sermon archives on YouTube or something. But I wrote a sermon about why put Buddha in the bathroom. And in that sermon, I did a little bit of research about Hinduism and idols. And I found a Hindu website about idols. And it gave reasons for idol worship in Hinduism. And some of their answers were: easiest way to instill faith and devotion, a way to acknowledge the omniscience and omnipresence of God, help devotees become deeply religious, and objects of concentration and meditation. Now, at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, it goes like this: And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or the earth beneath, or the waters under the earth. This seems very counterintuitive if you're trying to found a religion. Statues, idols, are all over the place in almost every religion in the world. Egypt was full of statues. In fact, those impressive statues continue to impress even thousands of years later. They focus the mind. They give people a sense of security and safety, all of these things that this website for Hinduism says that they do. And seemingly like a lightning bolt out of a clear blue sky, this command comes down. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or the earth beneath, or the waters beneath. What on earth is that about? Now, for a number of weeks, we've talked about the strangeness of the Jews. And if you're familiar with ancient texts, you find that there's some things missing in the Bible that we very much would imagine would be in different ancient texts. There's no story of the birth or origin of the God of Israel or the gods. And this struck one particular Hebrew scholar as very strange. And it's out of this observation and many others from the Bible that this Jewish scholar promoted what today we call revolutionary monotheism. This was like a bolt from the blue. Why on earth would Israel biblical religion be so different, as opposed to, say, evolutionary monotheism, where sort of gods get accumulated and combined, and then suddenly you're just down to monotheism? Biblical religion is fundamentally different from that of its neighbors, even if they share a whole variety of cultural similarities. Now, if you look at Greek mythology, you find that gods emerge from usually the union of earth and sky or something like that, and then all of these gods emerge and they're rather unruly. You'll find that in Babylonian mythology. You'll find it in Greek mythology. Kaufman, who authored this book, noted that, well, where do all these gods live? Well, they sort of live within what he called a meta-divine realm. And what's crucial about this meta-divine realm is that it's like every other realm around us. It puts limitations on us. Here in this space, we have the limitations of gravity. We can only be in one time and one place at a time, so on and so forth. These gods were subservient to the rules of this realm. Now, other gods were developed and emerged and tried to represent the powers of this realm, sort of like the Fates. The Greeks had the Fates. And so you actually watch this in various mythologies where they're trying to deal with the issues between, let's say, the arena and the agents within them, but they never really worked. The Bible begins in a very different way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In other words, God comes before heavens and earth and sky. And this story, as told by Israel in the Bible, is radically different from the perspective of all the other gods. In fact, this week, and there is just God, not any universe within which the God of Israel operates. Everything works beneath and at the behest of this God. I had two very interesting, I made one video of commenting on a conversation with Bishop Barron, the Catholic theologian, who's on YouTube, comparing and contrasting with a friend of mine, John Vervaeke, and his non-theism and classical theism, and I had a very interesting conversation. And it all gets into this rather peculiar perspective of Israel and what on earth we mean by this word God. Now, these fundamental differences between these worldviews play out in ethics and eschatology. Eschatology meaning what happens in last things, like after when you die. And if you look at the last two sermons that I preached, really, both of these sermons flowed out of these kinds of contrasts. Israel's peculiar, rather restrictive sexual ethic flows out of the fact that we belong to God, as do our bodies. The good news of the resurrection flows out of the fact that we're not made to be immaterial beings. We're made to be bodily creatures. And so our restoration involves the restoration of our bodies. Now, Paul of Tarsus is trying to express this radical difference to many people across the spectrum of culture and education through the ancient world. And we touched on that in our adult Sunday school class. And I also made a video recently, why do simple Christians sometimes outperform sophisticated Christians? Christianity can't be an esoteric religion whereby we talk about abstract ideals like a meta-divine realm. It has to work on the ground in everyday life at a level that people up and down the intelligence spectrums can understand. This is what we're going to get into in Paul's next stop in his tour. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. That's out of Thessalonica. We spent the last few weeks in First Thessalonians. On arrival there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those of Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. As a result, many of them believed, as did a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. And over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about this language about Greek men and Greek women. And you will notice that there's Berean Bible churches all over the United States because many Protestants saw this text and said, this is exactly the kind of people we want to be. We want to be searchers of the scripture to make sure that when someone shows up and starts preaching to us that this agrees with the Bible. But when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, some of them went there too, agitating crowds and stirring them up. The believers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed in Berea. Those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens and then left instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. So, as we've seen before, Paul seems to get all the heat, so Silas and Timothy sometimes stay later and continue to work with the budding church, but Paul has to go to Athens, and, well, what's Paul going to do when he goes to Athens? He's there unsupervised. Probably get himself into trouble. Paul was waiting for them in Athens. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Now, Athens today remains a tourist destination for many people in the world, and we want to see the Acropolis, the remains of these temples. What we probably aren't seeing is exactly what Paul saw and what disturbed him. And when you think of that, when you hear the word Athens and you think of Athens, you might think of the great philosophical tradition, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. You might think about Athenian democracy. You might think about Greek culture and Greek learning. In many ways, all of these ideas have sort of been sanitized and Christianized by the European Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Those are the images that flood our minds, but it's not exactly what bothered Paul when he went to the city. Now, why would this city of philosophy be so full of idols? Well, our minds immediately go to the philosophers and playwrights, and when we think about them, we usually think about them in sort of a washed, secularized version. Part of this is because the strange way that words are more durable than stone. Now, Paul is going to have to engage both with the guy in the street looking for help from money or power or something in the world to help him out of the corner that he's in, and he's going to get into it with philosophers, lovers of wisdom, who spent all of their day in these schools or in forums talking about ideas, not unlike what seems to happen on YouTube and Discord servers these days. Now, even the word school means leisure because, of course, most people in the world don't have all this time to sit around and talk about these heady ideas. They've got bills to pay and jobs to do and food to get in their mouths and to keep roof and shelter over their head. Wealthy people tend to have, a little bit more free time to not have to work. And for this reason, the city is filled with idols because all of these statues represent the powers that they hope to invoke in order to save themselves and make themselves prosperous and all of the things that people want. Acts 17:17. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jew and God-fearing Greek, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. So unsupervised Paul of Tarsus simply continues to do what he does. He goes to the synagogue and talks to both the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks. We talked about those two groups a couple of weeks ago. But then he also goes into the marketplace. Is he doing some leather work there? Is he, making a little money to be able to get by? We're not sure. And of course, he continues to talk in those places too. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. And of course, you can only understand what you know a little bit of. Now, a couple of words about the Epicureans. These are just some short summary statements. They don't by any means exhaust everything about these ancient philosophical groups, philosophical ideas that were widespread in Paul's day. Epicureans were thorough materialists, believing that everything came from atoms or particles or nature. There was no life beyond this. All that was human returned to matter by death, matter at death. Though Epicureans did not deny the existence of gods, they saw them as totally indifferent to humanity. They did not believe in providence of any sort, and if one truly learned from the gods, that person would try to live the same sort of detached and tranquil life as they, as free from pain and passion and superstitious fears as they. You get a sense that these might be sort of like secularized, regular people who don't pay a lot of attention to such things, but go about their way trying to make their lives as comfortable and pleasurable as they can. Stoics had a more lively view of the gods than the Epicureans, believing very much in divine providence. They were pantheists, believing that the ultimate divine principle was found in all of nature, including human beings. This spark of divinity, which they referred to as the Logos, was the cohesive rational principle that bound the entire cosmic order together. Humans thus realized their fullest potential when they lived by reason. By reason, in other words, the divine principle, for example, the divine principle within them linked them to the gods and nature, and they discovered ultimate truth for themselves. So the Stoics, and both groups are philosophical groups. This kind of philosophical pondering is probably more in line with what a lot of people think of as philosophy today. The Stoics held a rather high ethic and put great stock on self-sufficiency. Since they viewed all humans as bound together by common possession of the divine logos, they also had a strong sense of universal brotherhood. So these are the two groups that Paul tends to find more often in the marketplace. So they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Sort of sounds like a university. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." Now again, that sounds a little strange to us because we tend to think about Plato and Socrates and philosophy in the context of our universities, and that seems very divorced from religiosity. Now, that very much isn't the case, and in fact, we might want to think how this particular Greek word gets translated. I would think today, actually, it would be closer to something like spiritual or devout. Because actually the Greek word is deisidaimon. Now, daimon sounds to you like diamond, but actually it's the word much closer to where our word demon comes from. And as you might think, well, why, how they are in every way very demonish? Well, the daimon is sort of this spirit that moves us. It sometimes people experience as a little voice that speaks to us, or a notion that comes into our head, or a muse, or some sort of animated, energizing spirit that we begin to have a personal relationship with, and the spirit is sort of flowing. It might be, it's usually a little bit more concrete and personal than, let's say, the Force that you find in Star Wars, but you are very much into spirituality. These spirits that move the world, these spirits that inhabit the world, these spirits that take possession of us, and they might be framed as little gods. Cupid, of course, is a little god. It's the god of love that takes us over with passion. Anger might take us over. There's all these things that sort of take us over, and the Greeks are very into this, and they have all of these things instantiated in statues around the city to represent all of these gods that are at work in the world today. Now, we're sort of hearing this through 2,000 years of Bible reading, but as I said, it's the immaterial forces that move the world and us along with it. Socrates quite famously always listened to his daimon. Now, there's a long, complex philosophical history about this, and I'm trying to shorten it up. Because again, when we hear very religious, we tend to think, go to church, participate in institutions. They weren't necessarily participating in an institution beyond their citizenship and the city and all of the ways that these might personally affect someone. And again, today we might think spiritual but not religious, or spiritual and devout. Paul then stood up at the meeting and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very spiritually devout. For I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. These are how you are all publicly, socially, collectively managing these diamonds that are swirling around the world. And you have lots of statues because if there's a spirit out there that you're not satisfactorily paying attention to or appeasing or managing, it might come and harm the city or harm your life. In fact, as you can see, not paying attention to these spirits might put you into trouble. You look to these spirits in order to get you out of trouble. And it all seems to work much better in terms of us concrete human beings by instantiating and representing these spirits as statues and characters and stories. And in that way, well, we can work with the spirit world. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So there's a daimon out there, a god out there that maybe you have forgotten. And so, well, if something sort of comes out of the blue, let's use that to sort of appease or engage or attract or get on the right side. of this force or power that's moving in the world. So you are ignorant of everything that you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. Now, in some ways, Israel's God is sort of like the meta-divine realm in that sense. There is no meta-divine realm above Israel's God. All there is in the beginning is God, and then God creates. Now, it also isn't true that this meta-divine realm, as it is perhaps imagined in many mythologies, is impersonal. No, you can relate to this God. He is both arenic, as in the space in which we live, and personal, in that we talk and engage with him. Our relationship with this God is different because our God is fundamentally different. It's not simply a difference of one God versus many gods. What we mean by God and how we relate to this God, in fact, will change your life. And so what Paul does really in this short speech is sort of try to relocate their imagination about the world that they live in. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their land. In other words, these boundaries aren't created by all these little gods fighting and looking for more territory. No, this one God simply does it. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. In other words, it's not just the God way down there in this land, or the God over there in that land, or the God who can only come out when there's a thunderstorm, or the God who's only present when you have this certain feeling. This God is everywhere and always. For in him we live and move and have our being. And so what Paul is doing now is quoting from the poets and the writers that they would be familiar with to try and present the God of Israel in their terms. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Now again, the gods were offspring of perhaps the sky and the underworld, or the heaven and earth and all of these things. We ourselves are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In fact, if you go all the way back to the Ten Commandments, the reason God says, don't represent me in stone or in images, is for this very reason, that he, in fact, cannot be represented as just one more thing in the universe. That's not the way to think about the God of Israel. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day where he will judge the world with justice, by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. But others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed, among them Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Why does the resurrection trip them up so much? If you remember last week, we read N.T. Wright saying that for many in the ancient world, Homer was the Old Testament and Plato was the New Testament. And so part of what the Greeks were into was the thinking that immateriality was somehow preferable to materiality. And so once you had escaped the bondage of the body, you were in a better place in a better way. But the Hebrew conception of the universe says, no, we are exactly as we need to be, physical beings, and so our restoration involves the restoration of this physical world. We talked about that last week. Now, the seed sown takes time. Obviously, a few people listen to Paul, and this has been the pattern that Luke is very open with at each city. A few people begin to follow him and to seek him, and, well, how does that change anything? Well, a couple of weeks ago, I had someone contact me who lives in Thessalonica, and I found that quite interesting because I was working on the book of 1 Thessalonians for the sermon, and he wanted to ask me questions. Christianity, in fact, won. And so here's a Greek Orthodox student wanting to talk to me around the world. These tiny churches began with just the seeds of the crucified Jesus to put into the ground and to rising up to defeat death. And that's been the Christian story. These tiny little churches, these tiny little few people gathering together, beginning to, without idols, without statues in front of them, focusing them and saying, okay, here is my God, began to pray and began to worship, and bit by bit by bit, the world began to change. Now, what do we wish would have happened? Well, probably the Apostle Paul wanted to hear something like, oh, Paul, you're so smart. We all now believe in the resurrection of Jesus today, and we'll toss out all these statues and call him king. Can probably not find hardly any of those statues in Athens today because they all were put away centuries ago because they were found to be simply useless. They weren't running around trying to figure out how to represent these diamonds all over or these little gods and do obeisance to them. What happens, in fact, is they all began to worship the one God. Now look at how Christ and his Spirit work. Slowly, painfully, persistently. It takes time for his Spirit to colonize us and make us his own. Now, the helpful thing here is, in the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. The message of the resurrection continues as it was then. As Paul calls it in the book of 1 Corinthians, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. But it is finally the weight of that truth, the love and the beauty that slowly begins to move us into his likeness, to be his witnesses, to allow his Spirit to move through us and to change us. When we, in our anxiety, are no longer constructing a bull out of earrings taken from Egypt ready to be rid of us, that we are no longer constructing an image of the God by which we can sort of focus our mind because no image is adequate to represent God. And in fact, any image from the creation that we create is inadequate and will lead us astray. The icon of the invisible God, as the book of Colossians says, is Christ himself. So how do we bear witness to him, whether we are philosophical or whether we are simple? Well, for some it will be with our minds, with our words, with our sharing, those of us who work with our lips and our mouths and our thoughts and our ideas. For others it will be concrete. It will be hands and feet and money and gifts and service. That's how we bear witness to God and celebrate his victory. It will cost us all, however, because love is always costly. The day of judgment comes, and the day of glory does too. So we ought to be prepared. Paul keeps reminding us of this, and we ought to listen.